Okay.
All right.
All
Well,
right,
welcome.
Chris.
All right. Thank you very much, Brad. And my name is Chris Kubiak. So I am the Director of Education at the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. So I suspect a lot of you probably know Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve, where I'm coming from here today. Hopefully you've either been here, or if you live nearby or wherever you're coming from today, you'll want to come out here and enjoy our reserve and get to take in all the wonderful trails and birds and nature that we have here. So I'm going to talk today about a pretty, at times, depressing topic, and one that is a major, major challenge that not only are we facing today, but future generations. Those of you that will, I know I seem really old, I'm in my 40s, right? But I wasn't that long ago. I was a teenager myself and thinking about the future and thinking about, when I would be having kids, what the world would be like. So one of the most challenging things as we think about the environment here in Earth Day week is climate change. And climate change is one of those challenges that no matter where you live on planet Earth, whether it's in Fox Chapel or Allegheny County or Pennsylvania or across the world, right? It's going to affect all of us. And it's going to be at different degrees in how it's going to affect us as well, right? Some folks that live up in the Arctic are right now facing way faster changes than we are here in Western Pennsylvania, but we are facing very significant changes, which we'll talk about here today. So now, as I'm going through this, I want you all to really think that the future is not written in stone, right? When we talk about history, right, we know it's already happened, but the future has not occurred. So some of these things that could happen here, we still have time to make positive changes in the environment that's going to affect not just us, but all of nature. So today I'm going to talk about climate change and the fact that climate around the earth is warming because of human beings, because of our actions, and particularly with increasing carbon emissions here. And so working for Audubon, some of our various studies that we've done have come out recently to essentially influence and also inform people that climate change is really going to impact birds. Okay. And you might go, okay, well, I'm not super into birds. Why would I care? Well, birds play a huge role in our ecosystems, right? From everything from eating a lot of bad bugs that might bite you, like mosquitoes, to our food sources and everything around us. Nature's like one giant web, and there's all these different strands, and we're all interconnected. So if they're impacting birds, they're eventually going to impact us. And you may have heard a story in history, maybe in school, or maybe someone told you. I know my relatives used to be coal miners, and they used to take canaries at one time in the coal mines because those canaries would be basically their warning if there was some kind of danger in that mine from gas. And so if the canary stopped singing or fell over, they were like, uh-oh, we got to get out of here because this canary is telling us we're in danger. Well, birds are telling the same thing about us today, right? And so we're going to talk about that and how we need to understand their importance and their impacts in climate change as well. Okay. All right. So, and I'm going to go through our slideshow here. So one thing we need to learn in a lot of ways is that weather and climate are not the same. Okay. You may hear people go, oh, why should I believe in climate change? They can't even predict whether or not it's going to, rain or be sunny tomorrow. And, in some ways, right, it's actually harder to predict what the weather's going to be 2 weeks out than it is climate, believe it or not. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but weather, and we'll just go through a quick definition here, is really the state of the atmosphere at a place and time as regards to heat, dryness, sunshine, wind, rain, all that good stuff. So whenever you're watching this, look outside, what it is right now. So I'm looking out, it's cloudy. We had some fog here this morning and rain yesterday. That's weather, right? That's a day-to-day thing. Climate, on the other hand, is the long-term average of weather, typically averaged over a period of 30 years. So scientists and climatologists look at climate by taking all of the weather that happens in those 30 years and just making an average, right? And so some of the things, and this is a big word, meteorological, right? Meteorology is the study of weather. Climatology is the study of climate. Meteorological variables that they measure: temperature, how warm or cold it is outside at any given time, humidity, which today in this foggy day is quite high, right? It's with the amount of moisture in the air. atmospheric pressure, wind, and then of course, very important, precipitation, how much rain or snow we get throughout a year. You can make an average, right? I'm sure you've all done that at school in math class. It's very simple to create an average over time. And when you do, you start to see patterns, right? So scientists, climatologists look at those patterns over those 30 years and try to get an idea of what is going on. And we know by looking at climate going back hundreds, now even thousands of years, is that we are seeing an unprecedented warming going on planet Earth that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. Now, you may also hear from time to time people go, yes, but climate changes naturally and has for long periods of time. And that's totally true, right? Humans weren't around when a lot of different extreme climate changes occurred. But there's a common thread behind that, is that what caused climate change years and years and sometimes millions of years ago had to do with the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. But now it's humans that are driving climate change. So what we know is last year that we saw was the 43rd consecutive year that global land and ocean temperatures were above the 20th century average, right? So that means my entire life, we've seen the climate in planet Earth, right? And the global land and ocean temperatures was higher than our 20th century average. So that's a pattern there. Even bigger of a pattern that's sort of jumping out to us is that most of this warming occurred in these past 35 years. Out of all of our meteorological records, now that we can do records going back sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of years, 19 of the 20th warmest years on record have occurred since the year 2001, which is pretty amazing to me, right? And even closer is that 5 of the warmest years on record on planet Earth have all occurred since 2015. 9 of the 10 warmest years have occurred since 2005, right? And this is coming from scientists that study this, that look at all of the data. And if you're interested in learning more about the data, if you're like me, you like to play with data and all that stuff, you can go to NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information and look at this. They have all of that data there, right? The big thing has been happening on planet Earth is we see even more than the air is that our oceans are warming up way faster than they ever have, right? Because water actually holds heat much longer and actually much better than the atmosphere, right? And we can actually, again, record this, right, at any given time. So we see that as the ocean is warming up, right, and we're seeing the highest ever recorded temperatures in there, we can see then that sea level is rising. So if you go to the beach this summer, right, wherever you are, if you're in North America along the East Coast, I go to North Carolina every year, we can see that sea level rising. And we know that it's been rising here for the last 100 and some years. Closer to home here in Pittsburgh, right? You might say, well, okay, well, I don't live near the ocean. Why should I care? Well, without giving you a long meteorological lesson, which you may not want, but a warmer atmosphere means that it can hold more water. And when a warmer atmosphere can hold more water, that means you get more heavy rain events. If you live in Fox Chapel and O'Hara, you know, going back the last 5 years, we've had some major floods and even landslides because of more heavy rain events. In 2018 and 19 broke the record for the wettest years on record. And we're continuing that trend as we move forward here. So I always say, don't take my word for it. Investigate. You can go and look at the data yourself. But you can see by this particular slide here that of all of the data that meteorologists and climatologists and scientists look, you can see the 10 hottest American or US years on record are pretty recent, right? Last year, 2020 was about the 5th. 2012 was a very warm year, okay? But there's a clear trend that we are rapidly warming up here in the United States, and it's occurring at a greater rate. Now, we have detailed records of temperature globally going back to about 1880, right? And that's important because, again, climate, what we consider is our regular average climate is on 30-year averages. So if we can go back to 1880, we can have a number of different data sets that show us in that time period what the climate is, right? And how, if it was stable, if it was getting colder, if it was getting warmer. And the results are pretty telling, right? So if you look at this particular graph here, going back to 1880, you can see all of planet Earth. So if you took all of the average weather from planet Earth all at one time and average that in 30-year periods, and then you see this over decades, you see that from about 1880 till right about the late 70s, early 1980s, the climate was pretty stable. There was some up and downs with this natural variation rate, which we know happens. But we see something started to occur about 1980. And we see that the global temperatures rapidly started to rise, right? And scientists noticed this. And they noticed this trend of rapidly warming temperatures going across planet Earth until today. And the most updated as we see in 2019 is that we went from about 56.73 degrees Fahrenheit to about 58.71 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, basically about a jump of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Which might not seem like a lot, but I always use the analogy, think about a fever, right? As body temperatures, we're about 98.6, but if we get a fever just by a couple degrees in our bodies, like 102, 103, that might only be 2 to 3 degrees or 4 or 5 degrees warmer in our bodies, but that can cause some serious damage. And we're going to see that with climate change if this trend continues, okay? And again, this is just another graph because I love graphs, and I think science sometimes does not, because these topics are so dense, does not do the best job in showing you these types of changes. And you can see here, this is just another way of demonstrating through graphs, and this is with now Celsius, that the decades we are seeing some rapid warming, especially since 1980s, right? So look how quickly that's occurred, right? And we're going to talk about in a second here why that's happening, what are the causes, and how they're impacting birds, our environment here, and then ultimately you at your home. So other than just air temperature, right? So various scientists and meteorologists are always looking at thermometers, and right, you got your day-to-day weather, but there's other indicators that they use other than just temperature that planet Earth is warming. And they're called the 10 indicators of a warming world, right? So it's not just air temperature near the surface of the ground, which the fancy word for all of the place that weather occurs on planet Earth is called the troposphere, right? So in a warming world, right, you would expect to see rising humidity, which is the amount of moisture in the air, which we're definitely seeing. Temperature over the oceans, right? Because we know ocean heat content is rising rapidly. Well, we're seeing that as well. We know sea surface temperature and sea levels are both rising. And one of the biggest results to that we can see now is rapidly declining sea ice up in the Arctic. Every single year in the winter, the Arctic sea ice is getting less and less and less, which is a very strong indicator of a warming world. We're seeing glaciers are rapidly retreating because they are really, really what we call on the climate edge. Right, so they're just a few degrees that it takes for them either to completely melt or to expand, right? So they're very good indicators. And they too, and you're going to see some really good pictures here in a second, have been rapidly melting here in the last, say, 100 years. We also know over planet Earth, right, not just on a year-to-year basis, but over our 30-year period, that snow cover is also decreasing over time. So all of these indicators that we are seeing right now are showing us that planet Earth is definitely warming, and it's happening at a very rapid pace, right? And I always say one of the biggest things you could do, I've never been to Alaska, but boy, I hope to go there someday because I want to see some of these glaciers. And I have been to Glacier National Park in Montana, which is really cool, but go now because a lot of these glaciers are really starting to melt. And you can see this, right? So this picture taken back in 1894, which I know seems like a long time ago to us. None of us were born then, But in the term of both Earth's change over time and also climatology, it's really not that long ago. It's just a drop in a bucket, right? Or a blink of an eye, and how short of a time ago. And you could see this Mendenhall Glacier here, okay, has almost completely disappeared. In fact, it is sort of retreated so fast that it's now almost out of the picture completely. Now you have almost all open water from this glacier melting, right? And so we've said, right, the Arctic right now, to the north of us in Alaska and parts of Canada and Russia, is seeing the biggest amount and the most rapid amount of climate change. Look at this one, right? So the picture on the left shows that in my grandparents' time, right in the start of World War II, when my grandparents' generation, up here in the Muir Glacier in Alaska, you had this big glacier that was going through the valley there, and you could see there's no vegetation. But by the time my grandparents, I would still go over their house when I was a teenager, that glacier had receded so fast that now you can see on the right-hand side, and this is still from 2004, I got to find an updated picture for that. It had retreated so fast that it almost doesn't even exist anymore. There's no more glacier in that valley. Now it's warmed enough that you can see vegetation has grown, which in some ways is a good thing, but I'm going to explain here shortly why overall this is a real bad thing for all of us, okay? All right, here's another one of my fancy graphs that I just love to show, because I think it's really important when you are explaining people the impacts of whether it's climate change or anything in science, you have to have good data. So anytime we make decisions, data should inform us what's going on, right? And it should be, whether it's buying a car or if it's buying some new clothes, I want good data on that. I want to see if it's, there's good reasons for me to do this. So that's why I'm presenting all these different things here. So I've talked about that we know for a fact, it's a scientific fact, and it's not disputed in science that Earth is warming. But for a while, there were some people wondering, okay, what was the cause? Was it natural variation of planet Earth? Was it human beings exclusively? Was a little bit of both, which is more to blame, okay? Well, here's what I'm going to show you in this graph. So this is something that we call atmospheric carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide is something every time you exhale, right, a little bit comes out of your body. Other animals that do that exhale, they bring in oxygen, right, and exhale carbon dioxide. Trees, on the other hand, inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen, right? And most of the carbon dioxide that all of human beings and animals exhale is really not very much. In fact, most trees and vegetations will take that up. But you could see a really trend here. This is a long, long trend in climatology. And this is the amount of carbon dioxide in planet Earth's atmosphere going back 650,000 years. So this was when there's been multiple glaciers, right, that expanded out of the Arctic, came down towards us here in Western Pennsylvania. I live in Butler, and Moraine State Park is where the last big glacier stopped. And when you do that, when we're in the height of an ice age, there's not very much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So you could see that in this map. When you see it decreasing to the right in that graph, there's less and less atmospheric carbon dioxide. So Earth kind of cools down even more. And then as we get closer to the sun, more carbon dioxide kind of, as the glaciers naturally melt, some of it goes back up into the atmosphere, right? So you see the amounts rise. So that's all natural, right? The human beings aren't doing that. And you see this sort of up and down over this time period. And how do we know this? Well, scientists down in both Antarctica and the Arctic and Greenland have taken ice cores, and they can actually pull out frozen air that goes back hundreds of thousands of years and actually analyze that, which I think would be a really cool job. But our last glacial period, when there was glaciers in just north of us in Butler County, you could see that carbon dioxide levels decreased again to almost about 170 parts per million. And then it started to rise again until about the year, what we call the year before present. And then you see a almost vertical line going straight up. And that is because of us. So for 650,000 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide had never been above 300 parts per million until human beings started clearing forests, burning trees and various other types of plants for whether it's farming or other things. But really, the biggest thing was 250 years ago during the Industrial Revolution when we started to burn carbon heavy fuels. Okay. And I love this. This is one of my last graphs. I promise I'll show you. This is like Earth inhaling and exhaling, right? Because every year in winter, carbon dioxide increases because there's no photosynthesis. And then when we get spring like this, trees start sucking in all that carbon dioxide. And so it goes down a little bit. But you see over time, NOAA has and this is an observatory in Hawaii, has shown that it's constantly going up because of people putting it in the atmosphere. And right now we're about 410 parts per million, which is a lot, okay? And it's all because of these things. So this is coal, right? Western Pennsylvania has a really strong history of coal mining. My family used to be coal miners too, right? They came over from Europe and they were coal miners, and a lot of folks around this area, because there's lots of coal, that this is carbon that was once in the atmosphere that plants sucked out about 320 million years ago, and then got put into the ground over time. And so in the last 250 years, humans started taking this out of the ground and burning it for locomotives, and then for making steel here in Pittsburgh, right? And then of course for electricity. And this is, think about it, it's carbon that was taken out of Earth's atmosphere and held in the ground for millions of years that in a really short period of time went back into the atmosphere. And we do this. You can see this around here in Western PA, right? A lot of our power plants that power us historically have been powered by coal. The things are changing here. We also know that oil, right, which is ancient algae and all sorts of other things that we use to power our cars right now and trucks and everything else, it's very carbon intensive. And when they're burned, that coal and oil is burned, that carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere. And there's so much that we're putting in there, right, through our cars, through all of our congestion, right, that the trees and plants don't have enough capacity to take it all out. So it starts increasing more and more. Think of it like if you ever have smoke, right, and you're in a room, it just keeps increasing until you open up windows or do something to dissipate it. And so our carbon levels on planet Earth are like that room filling with more and more smoke that's actually acting as like a blanket holding in the heat on planet Earth. Another major impact to this, and a lot of people don't always consider this part of it, is human beings clearing our forests. Because remember I said, right, trees and plants are really important in taking carbon out of the atmosphere and giving us oxygen we need to breathe. So not just, this is the tropics, right, down in the Amazon and places like Indonesia where they're clearing rainforest to plant palm oil plantations, right, which are bad for a whole host of other reasons. But closer to home, right, we're doing the same thing. We've cleared lots of forests from that used to be all around here. And that's stopping Earth's ability to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? Even some of our accidents with, this is not carbon though, this is natural gas. We got a lot of natural gas around here in Western PA too. And that also, once it gets up in the atmosphere, if you have a leak, that can cause some major warming on planet Earth. So we got to be careful of all that stuff. So, right, so taking all of that information, right, that we know that the climate's warming, and people like myself. Now, I say this in a positive way. I jokingly refer to myself as a bird nerd, right? Because I love birds. Obviously, I work for Audubon. We do a lot with birds and nature, but birds are so cool in so many different ways, right? In some ways, right, they're the closest things we're ever going to see to real life dinosaurs because they're evolutionary descendants of dinosaurs. But these birds that you see, or maybe you're hearing singing outside right now, have specific ecosystems that they've evolved in. And there's certain climate things that they've evolved to that if this changes and changes too rapidly, it could negatively impact them to the point where some could potentially go extinct if climate changes too much. So for people like myself and other birders that go out there and record the birds that we see, and we put them in databases that scientists use, Audubon came up with a study about 6 years ago that said, here, just in the United States alone, if climate change reaches a certain level, we could have as many as 314 bird species on the brink of extinction, right? And to give you a reference point, since the North American continent was settled by Europeans and other folks from across the earth after 1492, we've only lost 9 bird species to extinction here. So this would be a huge negative impact on our birds on the United States and North America, okay? And so this report came out in 2014, and some of you were a little bit younger, right? So the scientists looked at these 588 species and their vulnerability to climate change, and we found out that half of them were vulnerable, which was kind of scary when we thought that. And so we used data for both the US and Canada, okay? And if you really like to get into data, if you're science mind and you want to sort of drill down to all this stuff, you can go to National Audubon's climate change report and look at all this stuff. But there's really good data. And I keep stressing that because in science, you need data to give you an informed opinion and what kind of actions you need to take, right? Data is so critically important, and we need to stress that is the key behind science. And so some of these things you see here, this is called community science, which means people like yourself can go out there and count birds in your backyard, and you can put them either in eBird or Project Feeder Watch, and scientists will use that data to make sort of decisions on things like this. And all of these, the Christmas bird count and all these other bird records inform that, okay? And so they used 140 million bird records. So that includes observational data. So people like you and me going out there and going, aha, I see a robin, or I see a blue jay, and it's this time of the year, so I'm going to record that, right? 140 million, which is a lot. That's a lot of good data. Then taking that data, they plugged in these climate models from these climatologists looking at a warming Earth from over 800 experts from over 80 countries to map where each bird might live in the future under a changing climate, or what might happen to them. And the results we got were pretty scary, right? Okay. And one of the things that they used right away is this. So I'm a big gardener too. I worked on a farm when I was a kid, and I still have a farm this day. I grow apple trees and vegetables and stuff like that. And you're going to ask here for a second, what does this have to do with birds, and what does this have to do with me and climate change, right? Well, this is called a plant hardiness zone, okay? And the reason why that's important is because if I'm going to plant things out in my garden, I need to know when it's okay, so it's not going to be frost free. Now, all of our trees and native plants that we have in your maybe backyards or around our forests here in Western PA also have to deal with this. So in our previous climate that we had, that we would have more normal type seasons, and there would be a general way that our trees and plants would come out, right? And so birds adapted to that. But you could see on the bottom there, back when I was in 7th grade in 1990, the plant hardiness zone map in the climate was much cooler than what it is today, okay? And that might not seem like a big deal, but that is a huge deal for birds and insects, right? So as you can see, it is definitely warming in our springs, and this year is a prime example. We are way ahead of average for a lot of our trees starting to leaf out and flowers that normally what I'm seeing as I look out my window here at Beechwood, you would see in early May, we are now seeing in middle of April, right? And some of you might go, well, so what, right? I don't like the cold, I like warmer weather. Well, that has some severe consequences to birds and plants and insects, and ultimately you, which we're going to talk about here, okay? So what's cool is I love field guides too. So when I go out there and I lead bird walks and bird tours and programs, I have my field guide, right? I have a Sibley guide. And so I say, okay, well, if we think we see robin, where do robins live across North America, right? And I can go in there and look at that. Well, this particular report, this was like a field guide to the potential future, right? Because the future hasn't occurred yet, of North American birds. So out of 604 species, they found 389 of our bird species in North America are vulnerable to extinction. And that means that as soon as 2080, more than half of their current range would become inhospitable and they wouldn't gain new ground. They wouldn't shift their range as it warms, right? That's scary. That's a potential major problem there. 99% of all birds would have to cope with more frequent extreme weather events, right? Like more intense spring heat, which we just had 80-degree weather, right? Which, again, that's still weather, but that kind of stuff is happening more and more. And also heavy rainfall events. So if a bird like Louisiana water thrush that we have down at the Trillium Trail or other places here in close to Beechwood, heavy rainfall events like that could wash their nests away when they have babies or eggs, which they didn't have to deal with in the past. We know in other places, right, sea level rise and urbanization could consume much needed bird habitat. We're already losing a lot there to begin with. So most birds will likely experience multiple problems. So it's not just climate change, right? Loss of habitat, pesticides, all sorts of things. This could also create some problems here. We've also, and this is not very good stuff here, but we have noticed, and I was born in 1976, but since 1970, right? So 50 years ago, so maybe in your parents' or grandparents' generation, if you took all of the birds in North America as individuals and added them up, we now have 3 billion less birds in North America since 1970. So we went from 10 billion individual birds to only about 7 billion birds today. If that happens in the same rate, in roughly 50 years, we could be down to only 4 billion birds, right? And that, again, billion's a big number, but you figure that as a huge decrease. And so the biggest thing that scares me is significant population declines occurred among hundreds of bird species, including those once considered very plentiful, right? So they've declined roughly by about 29%. So this is showing there's a widespread ecological crisis going on that we need to be aware of, and we can still prevent if we take changes in action right now. So closer to home, right? So that's scary that we're losing all these birds. And again, these birds, these are little baby piping plover chicks. They're some of the cutest little fuzzballs you ever see. And they were considered endangered, and they still are threatened. But now we're starting to see them show up again in places like Presque Isle up in Erie, where they haven't bred in a long time. So they were actually, we protected them, and they're making a comeback. But these guys could potentially, even though all the great conservation wins we've made for them, climate change could cause them to go extinct, right? And that's what we're concerned about. This is closer to home in Pennsylvania, right? And look how cute those little guys are. I guarantee you, every one of you, even if you're not a bird nerd like me, knows what this particular bird is. This is a ruby-throated hummingbird, right? And this is a male. You can tell by that ruby throat. And today is August 13th, and you guys are maybe going to be watching this in other days here in the next couple weeks. But depending on when you do, our hummingbirds could have already started to arrive. And they come a far way. So this little guy that you see here, every hummingbird this spring, if you see them, has come from somewhere in Central America. So from Panama to Costa Rica to maybe up to Mexico. And they made a single flight, 22 hours across the Gulf of Mexico. Every one that you see this spring, about a foot off that water, all the way to wherever you see them, whether it's your backyard or other places. And what's really cool about these guys is they need a lot of energy because they have such high metabolisms. They need about 1,000 to 2,000 flowers every day just to survive, because they're always really, in some ways, always on the edge of starvation. So you say, okay, well, what does this have to do with climate change, Chris? Well, as our springs warm up here in Western Pennsylvania, some of the flowers that our hummingbirds, like this guy, depend on are starting to bloom earlier and earlier. And our hummingbirds, they are leaving earlier than they were, say, 120 years ago, but not necessarily early enough to catch up. So there could be a time where some of these flowers are coming so early that by the time our hummingbirds get here to Western Pennsylvania, those nectar sources aren't there. And there is a community science program called Hummingbirds at Home that actually you can watch this in your backyard and see what flowers they use, because we're trying to determine that, right? So that's another one that we're concerned about. And this bird is also threatened by climate change. Here's a guy that probably most of you have never heard of here now. If you live in Allegheny County, though where I live up in Butler County, we get them, but they are also rapidly declining and climate endangered. This is called a Bobblelink. They have a really cool call, one of the neatest calls, and they fly above hayfields. And that bird journey to Western Pennsylvania, they're going all the way from Argentina in southern South America, across the rainforest, across the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to here. And climate change, if we continue to see that, will cause these birds to be completely gone from Pennsylvania by the end of this century. And then my last bird, and this is one of my favorite, and this is probably what got me into birding and wanting to work with birds. This is a Scarlet Tanager, okay? And this is a male Scarlet Tanager that here in the next 2 weeks, they're gonna start arriving. They're bright, this picture doesn't even do a good job, a bright scarlet red with jet black wings. This is a bird that over winter hangs out in the Amazon with anteaters and jaguars and snakes and monkeys, and come up here into Western PA. In fact, we have one of the largest areas where they breed in all of the United States. And again, as they come north, historically in previous climate regimes, right, they would have a sort of a typical spring where they come up and they know what insects would be there because the leaves on these trees would be out at a regular time. But with climate change, it's happening so fast that these cycles are going through so quick that these birds are arriving and that food is not there, right? So it's causing what's called an ecological disruption in a very rapid pace, okay? And as this Earth Week, right, Earth Day is coming up here, those kind of things really concern me as someone who loves birds, but also more importantly, wants a healthy environment for not just birds and other nature, but human beings as well. And so I'm going, before I talk about what you can do, right? This is one of my favorite authors that have influenced me to this day, and you're gonna see a quote by her, is a woman by the name of Rachel Carson. And Miss Carson was actually born here, real close to Cooper-Siegel and also us here in Pittsburgh. She was born right over in Springdale and went to Chatham and was a really famous scientist, right? And she often talked about the web of life, okay? So life on planet Earth is like a big web. We're all interconnected together, whether we realize it or not, right? Because the food that we get depends on weather and climate, the pollination of bees to other plants and animals doing ecological services, keeping water clean, that kind of stuff. And it's like humans with our changes in the environment is like tugging on those strands of the web of life. And it worries us, right? What happens with climate change if we tug too hard on that web of life? Are we going to cause the whole web to collapse? Okay. So that's something that as someone that involved in science and particularly birds, that keeps me up at night. It makes me think about Rachel Carson when she started to notice eagles and other birds starting to decline because of DDT back in the 1940s and 50s, okay? But with all of that said, I know that's kind of depressing and sometimes scary, right? It scares me, but there is hope. I don't want you to leave this presentation and think, you know what? We're in big trouble and there's nothing we can do. That's actually not true at all, because we know the future is not written and there are plenty of things that you can do right now and into the future to help change this and make sure that climate change is not going to cause these problems. And in fact, I have hope because of the younger generations, quite honestly, right? The ones that care about this particular issue and care about the environment. And they want a healthy environment, not just for themselves, but for everybody, including birds and insects, that you are our hope. And so here are some things that you can do right now to help deal and hopefully stop climate change, right? And one of the things is switching, and we're going to see here, switching to renewable energy. We're already on that path. So if you go on the turnpike, right, if you're going east or near Seven Springs, or you're going where you'll often see big wind turbines up there on the mountains that are producing renewable energy powered by the wind with no carbon emissions, right? And technology is getting better and better, that it's becoming more efficient, right? We also have solar panels and a whole host of other different renewable energy. And we are switching our energy sources to renewables, right? So what can I do? Well, one, this is limit the use of fossil fuels. Okay, so this is something that society can do, but I'm going to tell you how you can do this at your home. And we want to replace them with renewable and cleaner energy sources of energy, right? We also want to increase energy efficiency. So one of the easiest things you could do right now, someone says, what can I do today to help fight climate change? And that's be energy efficient. Turn off your lights, turn off your computer and your other various types of electronic devices that draw energy from the grid. Turn off your video games, right? Make sure, or if you have air conditioning or heat, make sure it's at a reasonable rate. Make sure that you're energy efficient. That's the number one thing. Plus, it's going to save you and your parents money, right? But the other thing over time is we need to switch over to renewables, and we're doing that. So if you're interested, and it's actually becoming very, very actually cost effective, is replacing the energy you use at your house with a renewable source. I have one at my house, and I'll be honest with you, our house where I live is powered 100% by renewable energy. And I don't have wind turbines or solar panels at my house. I use a company that actually gets all of their energy from renewable energy sources. So people can do that, and it's pretty cost effective. The next one is something you could be active, and that's take part in a community science program. So if you've ever seen any of the ones that we do there at the library at Cooper-Siegel, or we do here at Beechwood, right? We do lots of training. So that can be anything from counting birds around the Christmas time, or around in February, or throughout the year if it's just in your backyard. Or you can come out here with us. We also count frogs and a whole host of other really cool programs with plants, because that makes you engaged in science, and you are creating real data for scientists to use to try to understand what's going on right here in your own backyard, which I think is pretty cool. Another thing is plant a garden, right? If you like food, right, you could have a little garden. If you had grass, right, grass doesn't really do a ton. You can plant a garden, or even better, plant a garden with native plants. So native plants are plants that were here prior to settlement by people, because what that does is that provides insects and butterflies, and then of course birds, food and nectar sources. And it also will suck some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? You can plant trees. All of those things are really, really good for the environment. And then second to last, right? If you're really, really passionate about this issue, you can write or call or walk or tell or have your parents help you tell your legislator, okay, whether it's locally or at the state or at the federal level, that you think climate change is an important issue to you, and you want them to do action on the issue, right? Bipartisan. So I always say climate change is not a Republican or Democrat or independent thing. It's all of us, right? So it doesn't matter what your political leanings are. This is an issue that we all should be coming around. But honestly, the most important part of this is care, right? Because you, believe it or not, each individual, you have the power to create positive change in the world. I really believe that, because the future is not written. And people like Rachel Carson, who, when it looked like our bald eagles were going to go extinct, our national birds, she took the initiative as one person, and she wrote a very famous book called Silent Spring, okay, that changed the world. Rachel Carson from Pittsburgh. And Silent Spring talked about that. What would happen if we continue to spray pesticides like DDT, that of all the birdsong that we're experiencing now would go completely silent as a result. Now, when I was born in 1976, our country's 200th anniversary, there was only 2 bald eagles in the entire state of Pennsylvania. Our national bird was on the verge of extinction. But because she got DDT and other pesticides banned and people stopped using them, now bald eagles are so common that you can watch a camera of one of them down in Hayes, down in Pittsburgh, right? There's thousands of them in Pennsylvania today when it looked bleak. So we still have time. You just have to care. And each one of you can do something really positive, right? Okay, which I truly believe here. And like I said, gardens, I love gardens. I love planting. Maybe some of you do too, but these things are so simple and just such an easy way to help with climate change. So here's my last slide for today. I'm going to leave you with this here and with some hope. Because again, Rachel Carson is a huge influence on me and lots of other folks, right? And Beulah Fry, some folks in Fox Chapel know of her history, and her legacy that she left was very influenced by Rachel as well. And this comes from her Silent Spring. And I'm going to update some language because she wrote this at a time when the language was a little bit different, right? And I think this quote is very important because it talks about us as human beings, right? And she says, man or people's attitude toward nature is today critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. But man or humanity is a part of nature, and our war against nature is inevitably a war against ourselves, right? And we are challenged today as humankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. And I think to me, that sums that up, that I think that your generation coming up will be the generation that proves our maturity and that you guys are going to solve this particular issue. So with that, I thank you very, very much. I wish you all a wonderful Earth Week and Earth Day, and I hope you get out there and enjoy this wonderful spring that we're having, and you will want to take charge and take action here on behalf of the environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. Just maybe one more question before we end this is if
Sure.
anybody wants to get in touch with you or your organization, you know, to help out or to like come and talk about these kind of things, where would they get in touch with you?
Absolutely, Brad. That's a great question. So you can always go to our website at aswp.org. So that stands for the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. And you can see my emails on there, but we do a whole host of classes and walks, and a lot of them are free. Some of them are more sort of specific. We talk about some of these community science programs will train you how to do it. Or if you have an interest in gardening and anything at all, we probably do it, or insects. So just check us out at our website, or if you live in the Pittsburgh area, come to Beechwood Farms Nature Reserve here in Fox Chapel. You could stop by, you can ask for me, Chris Kubiak, or any of our educators and walk our trail. So we'd love to have you, and I'd love to share more with you here as well. So.
Okay, great, Chris. That was a great presentation, and we thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it.